This week on Act Out, Venezuela is under attack. As U.S. empire applies various violent tactics to destabilize the nation, a group of activists stand in the way of the war machine by holding space at the Venezuelan embassy. Next, Netfa Freeman discusses Pan-African issues and the neo-colonialist scramble for Africa, also known as AFRICOM. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. A recent report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that between 2017 and 2018, an estimated 40,000 Venezuelans died due to the economic warfare, popularly known as sanctions, imposed on Venezuela by the U.S. These coercive measures have grossly restricted the availability of food and medicine due to the freezing of Venezuelan assets worldwide. In an address to the Embassy Protection Collective in the U.S., Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza said on April 25th that Venezuela has almost 6 billion euros in accounts across the world that have been frozen by U.S. sanctions. As he put it, here's the money for food, for medicine, but it is blocked. So to be clear, the United States isn't just financially pummeling Venezuela, they are threatening countries that consider doing business with Venezuela. They're threatening them with sanctions. For instance, Venezuela recently sought assistance from Iran and Turkey for life-saving medicine. The U.S. stepped in and killed that deal before it ever gained serious footing. So the idea that this economic warfare is merely a slap on the wrist is grossly misleading. People are dying. And this recent report finds that should this economic warfare continue, tens of thousands more will die, even without military intervention. As Jeffrey Sachs, co-author of the report, noted, Venezuela's economic crisis is routinely blamed all on Venezuela. But it's much more than that. American sanctions are deliberately aiming to wreck Venezuela's economy and thereby lead to regime change. It's a fruitless, heartless, illegal, and failed policy, causing grave harm to the Venezuelan people. And it is this fruitless, heartless, illegal, and failed policy that sets the stage for this week's report. Because today we are coming to you from the Venezuelan embassy, which as we tape this is in its 20th day of protection, following the imperialist move by the U.S. earlier this month to expel diplomats and take over several buildings belonging to the elected Venezuelan government. The Embassy Protection Collective has been holding space here, in part in the name of the Vienna Convention, which states that embassies are inviolable, meaning that they are protected from the trespasses of the government whose countries they're located in. A recent and large example is that's why Julian Assange spent 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, because international law states that that embassy is technically part of Ecuador. So the British government can't just storm in and remove Assange until invited to do so by the government of Ecuador, which, in the case of Assange, is precisely what happened, thanks in no small part to the continued pressure of the United States. Because international law is nothing but a joke to us. The international community is nothing but target practice and lab rats to the great U.S. empire. I mean, just look at the news from last month when Secretary of State, that bloated sack of rancid cheese curds, Mike Pompeo, announced that any International Criminal Court, ICC, personnel seeking to investigate alleged war crimes and other abuses committed by U.S. forces in Afghanistan or elsewhere will be denied visas to enter the U.S. You know why? Because we know that we're guilty of war crimes. The very foundation and fabric of this country depends on war crimes. And therefore, the U.S. demands the right to perpetuate war crimes without any accountability to anyone. We are above the law, and any law that says differently, we just totally ignore. And this has been the case with Venezuela and the dozens of other countries that we attempt to overthrow. It's the same tactics. Be it that illegal coercive economic warfare, or the training of terrorists, the shipments of arms to said terrorists, often under the guise of humanitarian aid, election interference, the orchestrated attacks on power grids or other infrastructure, the US has a long history of tried and true, really bureaucratic-style moves to overthrow, destabilize, and control sovereign nations. Now, unfortunately, for the State Department, some activists threw a wrench into that seamless plan, which included ousting the elected government's diplomats in an effort to install their puppet diplomats instead. In order to do that, they need to take over the Venezuelan embassy here in Washington, D.C. But this building is far from empty. For more than 2 weeks, the Embassy Protection Collective has been holding space, as I mentioned, for the Venezuelan people. Having passed the April 25th deadline set by the State Department for diplomats to vacate the embassy, Secret Service has yet, as we film this, to attempt a forced removal of the embassy protectors. And it's not because they've seen the light. More than likely, they recognize the awkward situation that they've created. The protectors are the lawful guests of the elected Venezuelan government, and they have the support and permission of President Nicolas Maduro and his staff to be here. The State Department has no legal standing to remove us. Now, as I've noted, that certainly doesn't mean that they'll back down. Folks here at the embassy are constantly aware that really at any moment, Secret Service could attempt to enter the building and forcibly remove people. Far from being a deterrent, however, this only highlights the very reason as to why we are here. To take over this embassy represents not only a gross violation of international law, it is a clear and loud manifestation of imperialism. It is a tactic of the war machine, the decades-long tactical toolkit that overthrows democratically elected governments and installs puppet dictators to promote capitalism and protect profit at the grave cost of human life and social progress. And that includes Americans, by the way. We suffer too under the boot of imperialism. How could we not? That's our money that goes to war while social programs continue to be cut, our infrastructure continues to crumble, and our environments continue to choke. It's our paradigms, our national identity that continues to focus on global hegemony, a white supremacist domination that pedestals corporate profit over the well-being of the people. Because if we don't care about the human rights violations that we create and bolster around the world, why the fuck would we care about police brutality, about corporate sacrifice zones? In short, what happens in war never stays there. Our streets are bloody and broken mirrors to the horrors that we manifest worldwide. Imperialism is not a problem that happens just over there. It is fostered and refined here at home. And so it is here at home that we wage the movements against it. It is the U.S. empire that we hold in our sights as we demand an end to the hostilities against Venezuela. Indeed, this is not about whether you love Maduro. I've heard plenty of criticism of his government, from the left as well. And you know what? Good. People should critique their governments. They should demand better from their governments, on their terms, not ours. Because it's not my place. It's not my right at all to tell the Venezuelan people who they should vote for. My right, no, my responsibility is to ensure that my government doesn't stand in the way of the Venezuelan people's right to dictate their lives and their futures. Autonomy and self-determination are basic human rights of any people. And in an internationally recognized legitimate election, Maduro won the vote from his people. Should they change their minds next time around? Mazel tov. That's their right. But to tell them who their president is, to hand them a U.S. puppet that up until his coronation was totally unknown to 86% of Venezuelans, that's imperialism. That's white supremacy. That is a colonial fascist mindset that we must resist, that we must stand in the way of and build alternatives to. So that is why we are here at the embassy. That's why we're inviting you in to see and asking you to spread the word. That is why we're hosting events that connect this struggle to global struggles for justice and peace. That's why we're hosting artists and musicians so as to build and promote a creative resistance and uphold the beauty and power of what we are for. What the forces of imperialism and fascism can never be, can never create. Because no movement can sustain itself in negative space, on purely being against something. Because then, what are you protecting? What are you hoping for? Why bother? So, as much as we are against US imperialism, against white supremacy, against war, we are for autonomy, peace, self determination, solidarity, creativity, culture, and collaboration. We are for justice and truth, progress and human rights, love. And with this, we build our alternatives on the front lines. Wrapping up today, we follow the red thread of US imperialism to Africa. Back to Africa, one might say. Netfa Freeman is an organizer with Pan-African Community Action, and he sat down with us recently to discuss Pan-African issues and the neo-colonialist scramble for Africa, which here in the US is known as AFRICOM. Take a look.
African American actually, its history doesn't, the earliest coining of it was like Jesse Jackson saying we're African American. It's in response really to us coming to the conclusion over time and struggle that we're African people. So in a way, it's a kind of a subversion of that re-identifying with the continent, the mother continent, and not just saying, oh, we're African people because we came from there and that's our heritage, but that our circumstances, our condition is actually has a correlation with the people on the continent of Africa and other people of African descent around the world. So in the United States, and this is in the U.S. Tries to do this with its chauvinism, not just to black people, but everyone. We're American. We share common interests, economic, social, our heritage, history, all that, when it's really not true. I mean, there's some things that we share as people who are here, but there's some of that stuff that we share is also contentious, and it's also a disregard for where we come from and what kind of also where we've made connections with each other transcontinentally. Right. So anyway, so some of us have rejected African American and want to reclaim us as African people. African American, I would say, are those who don't really want to separate from the paradigm that is known as America, which is also have some chauvinism to it because this is a continent, and it's not just the people are not just America is not just the people in the United States, but they don't want to separate from the United States, so they want to say we're American and our interests are bound up with the betterment of what is America or the United States, which also the foundation of that is settler colonialism, exploitation, all that kind of stuff. So if we want to reject that, African people here have used black and African interchangeably, those of us who are political and who embrace Africa. And Pan-Africanism, that term refers to either a movement or ideological or philosophical framework that embraces that. So it's like we have a Pan-African movement. We can say the Pan-African movement, those things that have happened over time that constitute the actions and the motion, the economic cooperation, the capturing of our history and our heritage that qualify us as a one people, and that's Pan-Africanism.
Listening to you speak and reading some of your work, it's clear that you're focusing on the global issues that affect Black and African folks. So we're going to get into AFRICOM, but I do want to touch on the connectivity of these freedom struggles around the world. Why do you feel that it's vital to focus on a borderless movement rather than that, United States Black or African movement?
That's a good question. The short answer is that the forces that dominate the world operate borderlessly. They operate what we call transnationally. And so we can't, and they've been doing that on some level for us for a long time. If you talk about African people, so the first cooperation between the European powers that dominated the continent of Africa was in the 1800s with the Berlin Conference. And then, even now. So that's why it's important, and that it's also consistent with what we've already forged in terms of resistance and trying to build an alternative future. So that's also transcontinentally. Anything less takes us backwards, to try to confine ourselves here and only think that how we could overcome forces that are global is to take away our power to be able to do so, take away unity, courses of unity that go outside of the confines of these borders.
And another thing that echoes that, as you mentioned in a recent talk, that while the FBI was implementing COINTELPRO here, the CIA was undermining African social justice movements, at the same time. And what you said about that was colonization isn't about geography; it's about relationships.
And so so we're kind of taught in particularly in this country, which I can only speak pretty much for here, but I'm sure it goes with all of the colonizing countries or places. They teach colonialism in a very sterilized way. You almost don't even get a sense of the horrors and also the infrastructure of it. So the primary situation, the primary nature of it is not about the distance between those who are exploited and the metropole, which benefits from wherever the exploited place colony is or the exploited area is. It can be right. The metropole can be right next to you or within within you, all within the center of it. But the dominant or the most important aspect of that relationship is the power, the ability to dictate the terms of political and economic and social control over a people. And so we have to recognize that. If we don't recognize it, then they can fool us into think that when they have drone warfare in Somalia, we'll be saying things like, "Oh, we don't agree with what we're doing to the Somalis." No, we are Somalis. Right. It's tantamount to the same thing of when the U.S. or when the forces in Philadelphia and the government dropped the bomb on the state of Move. I mean, we have to see these things as the same because they are ultimately. Same thing with Libya. Oh, the NATO and U.S. action, what they did in Libya is not right. No, we are Libyans. What we did in Libya, because people will talk like that. And we say, well, we're Libyans. No, they didn't do that. We didn't do that to them. They did that to us. And it's a very important distinction. It's not just semantics, and it's a mentality that we have to develop, a mentality and a philosophy that we have to develop that helps us concretize and realize who the enemy is, who our adversaries are that are oppressing us. And so we're not creating divisions, we're actually recognizing the divisions that already exist.
And I also wanted to shift now into AFRICOM. Another thing, when you mentioned how they teach colonization, they also teach it like, oh, that's just something that happened before, right. And it's not a thing that happens anymore, which is, of course, ridiculous. AFRICOM is basically a new scramble for Africa. It's neo-colonization, an effort aimed at imperialist control over the political landscape and, of course, natural resources as well. So talk a little bit about what's really going on there, because, of course, some folks might be like, oh, well, yeah, we're fighting terrorism, right? That's what we're doing, which is, of course, the veil. That's what we wrap it in. But talk about what's really going on with AFRICOM.
So this is okay, first we have to realize or look at things, examine things through the, through the angle of how global economy works. And also the natural path of neoliberalism and capitalism. When AFRICOM was first established as a U.S. Africa Command, and that's what it stands for, people say it's U.S. Africa Command, it's the military presence of Africa, and they have these commands across the world. This one in Africa is called the U.S. Africa Command. It was established in 2008. It was established by the president in the George Bush administration, established it, but it was widely rejected even by the leadership of the countries in Africa. They were trying to find a place to have its headquarters, and all of them were like, no, it was easier than, usually the world is duped by these, the duopoly kind of thing, where if it's a Republican or it's like this, then we should reject it. And so it was easy for the classes of what I refer to as the comprador class. I don't refer to them. That's the actual title. Like comprador classes in Africa to say, no, we don't want that. Right. From Bush, and everybody's talking about Bush, and he's easy to make fun of him. But then the same year, Obama comes into office. He's inaugurated, and then it's easy. Everyone's trying to open up and be, a black president of the United States. And there's probably hope. People are thinking that maybe this is a shift in even how the U.S. Deals with other countries' foreign policy, and in particularly Africa, And so they're allowing all kind of agreements. Before that happened, they end up having to settle on the the headquarters of AFRICOM being in Stuttgart, Germany. So it's still there. Couldn't even put it there. And then there was only one country that was entertaining it. So there was like massive uprising against it. So once Obama comes into office, everything subsides, even from the people, because people think it. And so now we see like 1900% proliferation of what would be of a number of things that are considered AFRICOM. Military to military relationships are in all but one country, 53 out of the 54 countries in the continent of Africa. And as we understand it, Eritrea is that only one. And hopefully that will stay the case, but I don't, that they're really facing a whole, another thing when it comes to imperialism, trying to make sure they don't succeed and have self-determination. And then there's there's like special operations forces in so many countries, and military to military agreements, and all small military bases and what they call lily pad bases all over across the continent. So it's like really proliferated so much across the continent. The systemic analysis has to be broadened more and developed in terms of who holds the understanding that the root cause of the problem is capitalism and imperialism, and not this puppet government president who's been in power for 50 years or whatever. So there's a lot of actions against things like that. Get this president out, but then we're not talking about what we replace it with. We're not talking about the fact that it's not just this person who's in power that's the problem, but there's a reason that why this person is in power and can maintain power like that. And so until we really can broaden and that analysis does exist in a lot of the younger movements, like the Telema movement in the French-speaking countries, and like Burkina Faso and Congo, that are trying to collaborate with each other. I think once we can strengthen those kind of things, particularly the transcontinental collaborations in terms of them, then we can see some formidable resistance to Africa.
Yeah, and you see the same thing here, like, if we just impeach Trump, everything will be fine.
Exactly. It's the same kind of thing.
Nope,
Impeach Trump was like, nah, that ain't.
Yeah, and then you get Mike Pence.
Right.
Exactly. Like, what a great.
Somebody smarter.
Yeah, what a great improvement for everyone. That's fantastic. And it also, I think another part of that is that people here in the States don't know much, if anything, about AFRICOM, and B, the anti-war movement that was so like deadened by Obama's presidency, and that doesn't feel and feels detached from our perpetual wars, because they're not legitimate wars in the sense that Congress declared war, and it's just a perpetual, endless military-industrial complex, like free-for-all, basically, across the globe. So finally, I want to kind of wrap up on something else that you mentioned in a couple of your talks that I thought was really interesting, with regards to nonviolence, and it being not so much a principle but a tactic to be used when practical.
It's been taught to us that the civil rights movement, not the Black Power movement, but the civil rights movement at that time was successful, that we advanced and there were some gains out of that. We don't talk about what, there's not like strengths and weaknesses of it, or where we didn't advance. There's just, it was successful and there's some gains. It's along the path of progress, but also that success was tied to the fundamental principle of nonviolence. However, it's ahistorical, and it doesn't deal with the forces of like nature and the universe. I say it's ahistorical in a sense that many of our movements that even could say had the most success, and all of them, even the nonviolent movements, Dr. King had a bodyguard who was armed, right? And so how do we, and that some of the propaganda focuses on for example, when we talk about the Black Panther Party, they always leave off the rest of the name of the party, which was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? And so this is how they emerged, and a lot of our groups emerged that way. We don't talk about the Deacons of Defense or Robert Williams' NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina, that believed in armed self-defense, that were actually successful through their politics and their campaigns to desegregate the swimming pool there, to free the young boys in the kissing case that were locked up, these little children, and so that, and even also the aspects of like the Black Panther Party that were creating alternative economy and government like cooperatives and healthcare and education and feeding programs and those kind of things. And those were the paramount things. Those who you can't really, and so those were the things that are maligned and not looked at. And then every time you see the media depict people like either Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party, they seem like they're overly like they're overly wanting propensity for violence and want to they're just angry, and that's why it's not about us protecting ourselves or the success of being able to stand power to power with some arms or something and then fend off something that was getting ready to happen to somebody, which has happened. This has been the legacy of our movements, and we don't learn about them. And so I think this speaks to us if it speaks to the fact that if we take a position in the movement where we're always in a position of having to practice pacifism and nonviolence in the face of violence, then we, like Malcolm X speaks on this extensively, we disarm ourselves. And it's foolhardy to think that we should be subjecting ourselves to violence and putting ourselves in a position to plead for redress, to plead for equality or whatever the things that we should have as human rights from those who are inhumane and are actually denying us those rights. And so the only way we can get those things, one, we have to do it on equal footing, not being aggressors with anything, but actually being able to defend the outcomes of the principles and the decisions that we make, to be able to demand, no, you will not attack our community here. You will not send anyone in. And if you do, then you face the consequences. That has to be a principle. And so,
and I think that that's an important point too, that like people talk about violence when they're talking about self-defense, and even the law, like even the US's FACOCT law says that there's a difference, right? If you're acting in self-defense, that's all right.
Right.
So there's a violence is poverty, violence is lack of access to healthcare, violence is systemic racism, violence is not defending you and your community.
Right.
And so just that paradigm in and of itself.
Yeah, man, that's a good point, because it's actually the response or the outcome to violence being inflicted upon us.
To hear the full interview with Netfa, check out our social media pages and our podcast, which airs every Friday on Libsyn, iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. And to follow the Embassy Protection Collective, visit us on Facebook. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out from the embassy and elsewhere. From the embassy of the elected government of Venezuela, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a